aware of or something like that. Standard user analyzer is part of this as well, to look at issues with UAC restrictions that might cause problems for your application's functionality. Another tool that we have is the client Hyper-V, running Hyper-V on a local machine in Windows 11, and then spinning up the app in there. Just remember, you will need a piece of hardware that supports Hyper-V. But let's say it needs to run in a Windows 10 or even an 8.1 environment, right? If we've got that, we can spin up Hyper-V, install the operating system in Hyper-V, and then run the app from within there. Because it is another operating system, then you need to make sure you've got the right hardware for it as well. Okay, so not only the right processor and then the components for it, but also making sure that you've got the resources to handle running two OSs at one time. RDS is another one, remote desktop services. So you basically run your apps on another computer. You guys have, I'm sure, used RDS before to remote into a server to get some work done. So remote desktop can be running the other app. And so you can run that other app from the remote system. And you've got Windows 365 and AVD, or Azure Virtual Desktop. So you basically get RDS and Hyper-V technology to get a personalized as well as a compartmentalized user experience. So instead of the client running the compatible OS and Hyper-V, Azure will host the OS. Okay, so basically you can implement and manage VMs more easily without relying on either client hardware to support an additional OS or having to spin up any dependencies for an app in that client OS. Okay. So those are just some extra tools for you to take a look at. When it comes to preparing your network and directory for deployment, it's important to note that the network can actually be tapped a bit, large amounts of data when you're doing a rollout. And so there could be a negative impact to your network. So you need to make sure that you take advantage of things that can help you keep that to a minimum, especially when you're going across multiple WAN links, right? And so some of the tools that Microsoft makes available to help you with your deployments are listed here. We've got things like delivery optimization, branch cache, bits, and even LED-BAT, right? The Windows Low Extra Delay Background Transport, okay? So a little bit different than bits, and we'll talk about those here in a bit. But with delivery optimization, when you're looking at things like your Windows updates and upgrades and apps, those can be huge package files, and downloading those can be huge, right? So using delivery optimization can be useful in reducing the bandwidth consumption by sharing the work of downloading these packages among multiple devices in your deployment. You may have seen this before if you look into something like Windows Update. Okay, when you take a look inside of Windows Update or Microsoft Update, you're able to see that, hey, you can turn on the ability to share the updates with others, right? Delivery optimization can allow for this because it's a self-organizing distributed cache that allows clients to download packages from alternate sources in addition to things like internet-based servers. So delivery optimization does work with Windows Update or WSUS, right, which is our internal Windows Update server, Windows Update for Business, and even Configuration Manager. But delivery optimization is a cloud managed solution, so access to delivery optimization cloud service is a requirement. Also, your devices have to have access to the internet to use peer-to-peer functionality of delivery optimization. Okay, so you'll find those in some of your newer operating systems, Windows 10 and above. We also have what's known as branch cache. And that's a really cool technology that came out with Server 2008 R2 and Windows 7 Enterprise. And with branch cache, it's going to replicate files from a central location to a local device like a server. And so branch cache actually lets clients download locally hosted data instead of consuming WAN bandwidth. So if they needed something remote, they could pull it from a local source. Okay? So things like Windows Server Update Services, Config Manager can use branch cache to help optimize network bandwidth during an update deployment. And there are two different modes that branch cache does work with. One of them is a distributed cache mode. And so in that mode, each client has a cached version of the branch cache enabled files it requests. And then it itself also acts as a distributed cache for other clients requesting that file. But then you also have hosted cache. So in that case, you designate servers at specified locations to act as a cache in that area. So rather than clients having to retrieve files from a latent source, like going across a slow WAN link, the hosted cache server will provide the content on behalf of that user. We have bits, and bits has been around forever, right? You see, I think that was what, Windows. It was early on. I mean, we're talking, I think even before 2000. I think it was even a technology in NT days. Don't quote me on that. But anyway, bits have been around forever. Background intelligent transfer service used by developers and admins to download files or upload files to HTTP web servers and SMB file shares. But it basically takes the cost of the transfer and network usage into consideration so that the user's foreground work has as little impact as possible. Early on, we used to call bits the trickle download tool, right? Because you're really not going to notice much in regards to file transfer on your system because it's not going to impact your performance that much. Okay? So bits uses idle network bandwidth to transfer files. So it will increase or decrease the rate at which files are transferred based on the amount of idle network bandwidth available. So if a network app begins to consume more bandwidth, well, then bits is going to decrease its transfer in order to preserve the user's interactive experience. Plus, bits also adapts to network interruptions by pausing and then automatically resuming transfers even after a reboot. But bits will also transfer files when the machine is in modern standby mode and plugged in. So if an admin does enable branch cache on a client and server computers in an organization, then bits will use branch cache for data transfers. But then we have another technology that was introduced in Server 2019 known as lead-bat. Right? Sounds like a dangerous situation, but the low extra delay background transport is a network congestion control feature that helps to manage background network transfers. And unlike bits, which will restrict traffic, lead-bat consumes as much bandwidth as possible, but only unused bandwidth. So an admin might set bandwidth throttling for package downloads to 50%. With bits alone, the remaining 50% of bandwidth isn't used even when it's available. But with lead-bat, an admin can remove that throttling limitation because lead-bat will automatically scale back as latency increases. Okay? So different technologies there for file transfers. Okay? Something to note is that when it comes to transferring data, you've got profiles, right? Profiles. And so users' profiles sometimes can be quite extensive. There are what are known as your known folders, right? So you've got those known folders, desktop downloads and videos and photos and stuff like that. You've got those known folders. If there's a lot of data in those folders, it could take a long time to transfer information, and storage could be an issue at some point. So when many devices are being replaced or refreshed, the amount of user data to be migrated can impact that device's availability. In fact, end users may not be able to use their devices until their data migration is complete. So if they have a lot of data, well, that device might not be available for quite a while. Now, storage is inexpensive, client hardware typically has hundreds of gigs or more. User data can easily surpass the size of the OS end of the applications. So organizations should first consider minimizing the amount of end user data that is stored only on the client device. Right? That's the reason why many organizations go to things like a home folder on a server. Right? So when users do drop things into their desktop or into their documents or something like that, it'll all be stored on a server already, keeping their profile small. But migration challenges aside, the costs and risks are higher when data is stored locally versus centrally managed. Okay, so when there is corporate data on a desktop and users are working out of what's on their desktop and then their desktop crashes, that could be expensive stuff, right? So solutions like work folders and OneDrive and SharePoint enable users to work with their data as they typically do, even offline, while the data is managed and protected in a central location. And so tied with an effective deployment solution, users should be able to move to other devices and seamlessly have their apps and their data accessible. Okay, so that could be allowing for enabling replacements or refreshes and not be complicated at all. Okay. Now, if an organization has not adopted a centralized solution for their data, time to think about it. So that can help minimize the effort involved in data migration or even device upgrades. So tools like Known Folder Move can help migrate a large number of users to OneDrive without impacting their daily habits. And Known Folder Move is a really awesome tool to work with. One other thing to note is integrating with Entra. So your network directory, Active Directory, right, like ADDS, works well. It's critical in the deployment process as well. And so most organizations also anymore are using Entra ID for things like Microsoft 365 and Exchange Online. I find a lot of companies, that's what they start with, right? They move their Exchange server out and they start using Microsoft 365. But that also means that they need to start synchronizing accounts, right? So most organizations are using that, the ADDS, and then syncing data out to Entra ID. And so a lot of organizations have already performed that connection. But admins should consider doing that if they haven't already, right, to integrate directories if their organizations have on-prem but aren't using Entra yet. That will simplify stuff for later. Okay. So just one more little piece to think about there. Then once you've gone through all this stuff, you just need to think about a pilot, right? So with a pilot, give a lot of time to do sufficient testing. Okay, testing and documentation are key in these. Okay? So once your testing is complete and all known issues have been resolved, now we can start a rollout, but not until we get through our pilot phase. Okay? There's always a possibility of factors that weren't identified earlier causing problems. Well, but I tested in the lab. Great, that's a lab environment, that's a contained environment, that's a controlled environment. You need to spread it out a bit, right? Start thinking about that. So with a phased deployment, that's going to be a big thing to look at, right? So phased deployment, you notice we're taking a look at a few phases. Of course, phase one is going to include the IT team, right? Get them going first. And so that IT team will have to eat the problems first. But it's good because the IT team is in a position to help fix these things. Also, early adopters. Hey, you got some folks that are excited about technology. Anybody that wants to volunteer to be part of the pilot, great. It's a good idea to use them. Okay, they'll be also your promoters later, right? For your for adoption. But with those early adopters, with the IT team, as they're using their new operating system, testing out the apps, testing out functionality, they're going to tell you when there's problems. Right? Document those issues. Don't just keep it in your email or your Teams chat or whatever like that. Document it, because as you document these things, you'll also be able to document the fixes. Okay? It's important to have engaged members in the initial pilot phase, and then be sure to pay attention to their feedback. For the pilot group, once you feel good about the first phase, getting the early adopters involved, then move on to a pilot, a larger set of users. Okay, this needs to be a mix of roles, devices, types, apps, office add-ins, and stuff like that. Okay, it should also be low-risk users or devices that will minimize the business impact during the pilot. Okay, so now you start going to a broader audience, and I always recommend that with that pilot group, you grab at least a couple of people per department to be part of this, right? Well, but we tested it with this one department. Great. That one department uses one set of apps. It uses one, in some cases, one set of equipment. If you don't test it with other departments, you're not going to know the impact fully on them as well. And so for that particular phase, make sure you're using things like endpoint analytics to help gather information from those boxes. And it's important to communicate changes and help users take advantage of new capabilities. So a little bit of training as well will be part of that. Sometimes as these phases come out, users might ignore any emails. Hey, we're letting you know of new capabilities. Whatever. That's a geeky IT thing, right? No, they need to not ignore it. So work with their management team to help with this as well. But keep their input, right? Need their input on timeframes as well to avoid, so that you can minimize disruption. So perhaps, we're trying this rollout, but it's at the end of a fiscal quarter, right? And so finance may not be too happy about this, or product development teams during a product launch. Hey, we're having a launch. Great, we're upgrading your computers, right? That will frustrate them. Okay? And then phase 3, this is where you start doing broad deployments. Okay, so you've gone through, you set up your processes, your communication, your training, your self-service tools, and many times you learn so much in phase 1, especially if you're documenting and you're having regular meetings about this. You've learned so much in phase 1 that it helps in phase 2. You've gleaned so much more in phase 2 that when you get to phase 3 is, I don't want to say a breeze, but it can work pretty flawlessly because you've gotten so much of the kinks worked out in phases 1 and 2. And you have great documentation to help you as well. But don't just look at the technology end of things, right? Look at your communication plans and your training plans for the organization. Okay? Training can't be overly stressed here. Okay? And then document and collect any feedback. This information, this feedback that's coming back, I would suggest building a SharePoint site with all of this information contained in it. Okay. And then especially if you start using tools like Copilot can then be grounded in that information. And so anytime these issues do arise, you can pull data from the web, but also from things you've already done. And so it could be grounded in your SharePoint site and then pull data from the SharePoint site. So if there is a problem, well, it can always you can always work with Copilot. Copilot will give you a suggestion from what you've already done before. Okay? And it can make your life a lot easier. Now, one of the most awesome tools, I love the MDT. I've been a long time deployment person, right? And so back in the old days, we had a tool called the BDD, Business Desktop Deployment Tool, and then Microsoft moved it into the MDT, which is the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. And so let's talk about moving from traditional to modern, right? And to modern management, and where on-prem solutions best fit into today's enterprise. So we're going to talk about the MDT. And there are several on-prem methods that have been traditionally used to help facilitate your OS deployments within your organization. But while there are newer cloud-based solutions, on-prem tools still have a place, right? And so one of these on-prem tools is going to be the MDT. So we'll talk about the MDT, and I'll spend a little bit of time on the MDT, and then you'll note that there's a chunk here on managing and deploying images using MDT. That's going to be a homework one. So I'll touch on it. Won't spend tons of time on it, but that'll be a good one for you to do some digging into. All right, so evaluating traditional deployment methods. Okay, now until Windows 11, the method of choice for deploying an OS was typically imaging a device, right? So imaging means you're going to take some pre-configured OS and you'll blow it out to a large group of computers. And so historically preferred, right? Manual methods, manual installation may not be the best, best technique. So imaging, that's still supported in Windows 11 and later, right? It works well. But admins must decide whether to use a default image or create a custom image. And so the Windows install files include the default OS image install.wim. Okay, default image for the OS is install.wim. And that image is a basic OS image that has standard set of drivers. So when you use the default OS image, configuring the OS and installing apps must be done separately after the image is deployed. Well, configurations and applications can be included in custom images. And so tools like DISM, maybe you've heard of DISM, the Deployment Image Servicing and Management Tool, which is a command line tool, can help you with servicing and preparing those Windows images. And so it can capture the image of a reference computer with that desired OS settings and applications, and also be used to mount the image to make modifications. So you can take a OS image and mount it to the operating system as though it were just a file system, and then you can get in there and make any needed changes. Another tool that we use along with our images is sysprep. Sysprep then generalizes the image. It strips it of all its computer-specific information, any installed drivers, any SIDs, any GUIDs that are associated with that particular machine. Basically, it forgets who it is, and it just turns it into a stripped-down operating system. Now, it may keep all of the apps and other things that you've added, but it is now roll-outable, right? It's deployable to multiple systems. And so generalizing the image makes it ready for deployment. I don't know if you've tried it before, but if you've ever tried to take an image of a computer that you didn't generalize and then push it out to several computers, there's confusion on the network because they all think they're the exact same computer. And communication is very challenging at that point. So there are advantages and disadvantages to using both the default image and the custom image. If you're looking at a default image, notice there's no need to create an image. It's already there, right? You got your install.wim. Apps and settings do have to be applied separately. So it's a vanilla operating system. There's nothing in there. Note that there's one image per architecture that can be used for the organization. One x86 for 32-bit, x64 for 64-bit, depending on the operating system, right? Windows 11 is only a 64-bit, so you're not going to have that as an option. Updates to apps do not require the image to be rebuilt because there's really no apps built into it except for the built-ins. Overall deployment time is typically slower as configurations must be applied. Apps have to be installed after the OS image is deployed. In fact, some apps can be difficult to automate the installation. Okay? So with the default image, there are some benefits. You're starting off fresh. There are some drawbacks. It may take longer and it might be a little bit more complex to get set up. With your custom images, the image has to be created and then maintained. But note, apps and settings can be included in that image. And sometimes it leads to a very huge image. The configuration and the app requirements and sometimes hardware of each group within an organization can typically require several images to be created and maintained. And so updates to your apps cause images to become stale, requiring the images to be updated or recreated frequently, right? So if I have to, in traditional style, if I have to update a custom image, I have to push it onto a computer, make any needed changes, run sysprep to strip it, and then re-upload the image. Your overall deployment time, typically faster because it's got everything already built into it, right? And when apps are installed on the reference machine, they're typically easier to deploy when included with the image, right? So there's less challenge that's associated with that. Now we also have what are known as thin and thick images to be aware of. So when you're choosing how to image, thin and thick images refer to what the image contains beyond the OS. Okay? Thin images might be just the default image or custom image with just the OS and a few drivers to make sure it installs correctly. A thick image will have all of the apps that are in it. Okay? So thick apps or thick images may seem like a great idea, but that means there's a lot more stuff you have to update and maintain. So thin images are going to be the ones recommended, and then use tools to help you with software deployment afterwards. Then you also have a boot from VHD capability. So instead of installing the OS directly on the physical drive, well, Windows 7 actually introduces capability of being able to boot from a VHD. So using tools like Hyper-V, PowerShell, or even the disk management console, you could take a VHD or VHDX file and apply that image on a device and then boot from that as though it were natively installed on that storage device. So you're now running out of that .vhd or VHDX file. So there's a few different ways that deployments can take place. But one of the cool tools that we have at our disposal is this MDT. MDT. And so MDT is going to be a unified collection of tools, processes, and guidance for automating desktop and server deployment. Okay? And so you can use it to create your reference image or as a complete deployment solution. So it can actually help you to reduce the time that it takes for rollout and then standardizing the images. And note, it does support Windows client and server deployments. Now, the MDT builds on top of the Windows ADK or the Windows Assessment and Deployment Kit, because the MDT is going to give that extra guidance and features that are designed to reduce the complexity and the time required for deployment in an enterprise environment. MDT is what's used to help with ZTI. What's ZTI? ZTI is zero-touch installs. In other words, user doesn't have to be involved. They basically just sign on and they're good to go, right? So ZTI, zero-touch installs. They don't have to fill in a computer name. They don't have to fill in some of those details like a locale or anything like that. That's all taken care of for them. MDT will answer a vast majority of what is part of a setup process. And so MDT does require ADDS, okay? And so with Active Directory Domain Services environment, it will join endpoints to AD during the deployment process to a specified OU. Okay, so you don't have to just dump them all into the computer's OU. You can put them into a specific location. It does require Windows Server 2016 or later. Okay, and so this is going to host the MDT installation and setup of the deployment share for content that will be used. The ADK is going to be an important piece because the ADK, it's a pretty sizable download, but it is the core of what MDT builds on top of. A couple of other things listed here are WDS and WSUS, right? WDS is the Windows Deployment Services for rolling out images to an organization, and WSUS is there for you to do updates. Okay? There are a variety of different components that are part of working with the MDT. So when you take a look inside of or work with the MDT, you can start building or adding in things like the drivers you're going to use, any software packages you want to blow out, any task sequences that need to take place, right? So, hey, do this first, and then do this, and then do this, right? So when you go in and you start working with the MDT, then you'll have the opportunity to really define your entire install process. Manage and deploy images. Okay, so images with MDT, one of the first things you need is a reference image. And so as you get in and you work with MDT, that has to be one of the first things you add. Okay, MDT can't help you to customize something if it doesn't know what it's customizing. So create that reference image, get that going. Okay, and so the reference image, and then add on the prereqs, right? Like where the deployment share is and any configuration rules and settings, but add apps to that captured image. Okay, any apps and scripts that you want to install to the MDT build lab share. Okay, so any apps that you feel like you want to roll out can be added in there. And that can also be things like adding in any task sequences. And then lastly, number 3 here, deploy a reference image. Okay, so you have that sequential set of steps that will reference various components imported into MDT. So there's a ton of stuff. I'm going to tell you right now, there are a ton of things that you can do in the MDT. Okay, so spending some time with MDT is going to be very enlightening for you. But notice gather, right? So you're going to gather all of the resources that are going to be available or needed, and including gathering the OS. Format and partition disk is going to be another phase. Okay, so now you can format the drive, you can chop it into smaller bits if you need to and format those. Apply the OS image, whatever the image is that you're choosing to roll out. Injecting drivers and installing your apps. Okay. The reason why inject drivers is here as opposed to apply OS image is because you can leave the OS pretty vanilla, right? So less modification is required. And then you inject the drivers afterwards. So depending on where it's being rolled out, some environments we may be using brand X computer, whereas other departments may have chosen to work with brand Y computer, right? So those drivers, maybe you could take advantage of the generic drivers. Who knows? But depending on where your images are going to be blown out or rolled out, deployed, you may have a different set of drivers. So if you have, one or maybe a couple or few images, then you can customize it with these last couple things here, with injecting the drivers and installing your applications. So try to keep your OS as minimal as possible, and then use some of those other task sequences to do your customizations to that image. Now, when it comes to methods of install, of course, we've got user-driven, right? UDIs. That's going to be your traditional method, right? So the user interacts, they can choose stuff, they configure whatever they want, they can select apps and things like that they want to install. And with a user-driven UDI installation, UDIs do allow end users to decide certain options. So that's a technique you may want to use. Who knows? Light touch is one that's frequently used. And so light touch, automated deployment, it may require some user intervention, right, to answer a few things like a name of a computer or what keyboard you want to use, stuff like that. And so MDT, config manager do support LTI. And so it is traditionally used. But one that we may want to think about using, which does take a bit more infrastructure and a little more complex, is ZTI. The deployment is completely automated. There is no user intervention required and can be initiated by an admin, right? So good when doing many deployments simultaneously. Note, it can be quite a bit more complex to set up, and it does require using config manager. So just some things to note there in regards to deployments. All right, so we spent a little bit of time talking about assessing readiness. and also using tools like the MDT to help us out. And so you're going to enjoy using some of these tools, I'm sure. I love the MDT and the BDD back in the old days to really customize what I'm going to do with my operating systems as I'm rolling them out. Now, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and when we come back, we're going to dig into deploying using cloud-based tools. So we'll see you back here in about 5 minutes. Thank you. Okay, 5 minutes just flies on by. So welcome back. We're going to keep on going here. We've got quite a bit more to get through. So we're going to talk a bit about cloud-based tools now. Some deployments using cloud-based tools. And so we're going to discuss this thing called autopilot. In fact, Microsoft tests pretty heavily on autopilot. So I would suggest that you spend a lot of time reviewing and studying about what autopilot is. Okay. There's a lot to it. Actually, it's not a ton to it, but you need to understand the scenarios that go into working with autopilot. And so I'll discuss some of these things with you today, but definitely make sure you spend some time researching autopilot. Okay. So let's dig into deploying devices using autopilot. We'll also talk about implementing dynamic deployment methods. Okay, so like with subscription activation, provisioning packages using Entra Join, planning a transition to modern endpoint management, managing Windows 365, managing AVD or Azure Virtual Desktop, and exploring the Microsoft Intune suite. All right, so let's talk devices and getting those deployed with autopilot. Okay, now with autopilot, you can use autopilot to deploy new hardware or refresh existing hardware in an organization with a desired configuration without having to worry about traditional imaging. Okay, so we're going to talk about using autopilot for modern deployment, looking at the requirements, preparing device IDs for autopilot, and then I'll just spend a little bit of time discussing with you implementing device registration and out-of-the-box customization, and even examining scenarios. That's going to be some homework stuff that you guys will do, and then how to troubleshoot the autopilot environment. So autopilot. Using autopilot for your modern deployment. You know, with modern deployment methods, it's a new approach on rolling stuff out. Okay, so users in your organization can use a new operating system out of the box without needing a Windows image, right? So they can be pre-configured and ready to go. They don't have to worry about any of the fun little setups and stuff like that along the way. So yeah, with autopilot, you don't need to use images. You don't need to customize deployments. You don't need to inject drivers. You don't need to deploy and maintain a deployment infrastructure like with WDS, right? You can configure autopilot deployments, and those are relatively simple compared to all that testing and putting things together you have to do with traditional images. And with no image really to deploy, well, heavy bandwidth consumption is no longer a concern. So autopilot is one of your cloud-driven and techniques, and then it's based around your Entra and Intune environments. So with autopilot, you can join devices to Entra ID automatically. You can auto-enroll your devices into Intune. You can restrict the creation of an administrator account and even customize the out-of-box experience, or also what's known as an UBI, specifically for your organization. Now, with new devices, most organizations do purchase a new device from an OEM, right? And so in that process, they buy the device. It has a Windows 11 license it's already on there, but organizations rarely want that image, right? So they just go through and re-image the box. Well, you don't have to do that when it already has Windows 11. So regardless of the OEM image, autopilot can reconfigure that device to suit your needs. Okay, so that includes installing things like line of business applications and even changing the edition, like going from Pro to Enterprise. And so from a user standpoint, turning on the device gets the UBI going, during which the organization determines which options should be configured by the user. But one potential benefit is the ability to have a ZTI, meaning it's just ready to go when the user gets it. But then we may also want to refresh some devices. Now, something to remember, not all devices can be refreshed, right? If we're going from Windows 10 to Windows 11, somewhere along the way, early on in Windows 10, we had devices that weren't compatible with Windows 11. So you can't just necessarily refresh the box. You may actually have to replace it, right? But for refreshing existing devices over time, you may find a situation where it's going to be good to refresh an existing device. So performance might be impacted. More apps are installed over time. You may have some intermittent issues or challenges that aren't easily resolved. So IT might just elect to perform a wipe and load. And so autopilot can be used for that very thing. Also, if a device is reassigned to another user, no problem. You can reset the device with a new UBI as if the device was wiped and re-imaged. Okay, so you can still do traditional methods, but with modern deployments, you may have some more extra configurations available. Okay. Now, don't look at autopilot as an end-all be-all for everything. Like if you're doing bare metal deployments, yeah, it's not going to work so well. Or when storage hardware, where some of your images have to be replaced, not going to work out so well. If you've got a corrupt installation already, and so the install files are all messed up, not going to work out so well. Okay, so but nonetheless, autopilot can be used for many situations. Okay, and so let's take a look at this. There we go. Yeah, I'll move on to the next one here. So some requirements for autopilot. Note, you do have to have Windows 11 pre-installed. Okay, so Windows 11 pre-installed with Windows Pro, Enterprise, or Education. Your device must have internet connectivity because autopilot is a cloud service. Okay? Intune or some other mobile service management, mobile device management service needs to be deployed. Okay? Needs to be there. And then devices have to be registered to the organization. Yes, there is some device-specific information that gets uploaded to the cloud. Okay? Organizations have to be using Entra, as well as Intune or the Microsoft Store for Business, and access to the required URLs. There's a bunch of them, right? Like go.microsoft.com, login.microsoftonline.com, signup.live.com, download.windowsupdate.com, right? There's a variety of them. But one of them that's listed on here, like number 4, device IDs, device-specific information gets uploaded to the cloud. And so once you meet all the prereqs, you can set up autopilot, but you need those IDs. Okay. And so when looking at preparing your environment here, autopilot deployment process does require the obtaining of hardware IDs of the devices that you want to deploy. And then uploading those IDs, creating a autopilot deployment profile, and then applying the autopilot deployment profile to the devices or device groups. And so if you want to manage autopilot in Intune, well, then you must configure automatic mobile device management enrollment for Entra joined Windows 11 boxes. And then you can also configure automatic MDM enrollment in Intune. Then you have to prepare a autopilot deployment. Okay, so make sure you've got Intune and Store for Business going. Note that you must perform the step of uploading device-specific information, including hardware IDs, in Store for Business or in Intune. Okay, if you plan to manage autopilot in Intune, you'll have to sync autopilot devices from Store for Business to Intune. Now, to deploy devices using autopilot, get a CSV file that has the device-specific information. Okay, so if your OEM does support autopilot, and a lot of them do, then you can obtain a CSV from them when you purchase the devices. Or you could also generate your own device-specific CSVs based on your device inventory. There needs to be 3 columns in that CSV: a device serial number, a Windows product ID, and a hardware hash. Okay, now one of the things you can do, you can get that from the vendor. If you don't have that, maybe you're just going to refresh the hardware you currently have, get your own CSV. So one of the things you do is you run a PowerShell command, install-script space dash name space get dash Windows Autopilot info. Okay, and so once you've got that, right, you download and install that script on your box, then you can run get dash Windows Autopilot info.ps1 space dash output file, and then define the location where you want that written to. Okay, and so that's going to create a CSV file for that particular device. You can start collecting all that information, load it all into that CSV file, and then import it directly into your autopilot service. Okay. So if you want to actually do this with Intune, okay, you can go into devices, and then under enroll devices, choose devices, and then choose to import. Look for that CSV, import that file. After this import is complete, then for device enrollment, select Windows enrollment and autopilot, and then choose to sync those devices. Okay, so you can always import that directly into your Intune environment. Now, in some situations, it might be beneficial to directly import the device hash into Intune rather than generate the file. Okay? And so you can use that same get-windows autopilot info.ps1 and then do a dash online, okay, dash online. And so that knows that, hey, we're going to be adding it into our online environment, right into Intune. So just some, let's see here, some autopilot scenarios when we use this. Well, we're looking at a few different scenarios, right? Like a user-driven mode. So that could be an autopilot scenario. So user-driven mode is designed to enable new Windows 11 devices to be transformed from their initial state from the factory into something ready to use without IT personnel having to touch it. Okay, and so to enable user-driven mode, then it'll enable the device to be turned on, right? So the user turns it on. They can do some basic setup, right? So the user joins to the Entra ID, and then they can go through the process of utilizing that box. Now, user-driven mode is supported for hybrid Entra ID join as well. Okay. We also have self-deploying mode. So Windows Autopilot self-deploying mode enables a device to be deployed with little to no user interaction, giving you that ZTI effect, right? With all the UBI prompts being pre-configured for a response. And so the enrollment status page will display while the device is being configured, and then the computer will either complete and display the sign-in screen, right? And then ready for the user to sign on. Now, if it's being assigned as a kiosk, it'll automatically sign in by using that locally configured account. You also have autopilot for existing devices. Autopilot for existing devices. So we talked about earlier, autopilot does require a device have at least Windows 11 on the box. And then you can go through a user-driven mode install, right? But when working with existing devices, note that a task sequence needs to be there to deploy the image to older boxes, right? So if you've got an older system, then autopilot has to be configured to push out that operating system onto that older box. You can also use Windows Autopilot for pre-provisioned deployments. Okay, so autopilot can also have the capability that enables partners or IT staff to pre-provision a PC, so it's fully configured, business ready. And so from the end user's perspective, autopilot user-driven experience is unchanged, but they get their device fully provisioned state faster, right? So it's already set and ready to go, right? So instead of the entire provisioning process occurring when the user powers on the device, Well, it's already pre-provisioned, right? So time-consuming portions like device and user application installs, policies, those are all completed by IT. And then the final user settings and policies are applied when the user connects and powers on the device. Last one that's here on the list is an autopilot reset. And so in a lot of environments, you regularly need to reset the devices to initial states after they've been in use for a while. Perhaps you've got temporary employees, and so you want to reset the device every time a new temp comes in. Organizations also reset computers in training rooms after a class. And so with traditional deployments, you basically re-image everything. Well, autopilot reset enables you to achieve that goal without having to redeploy an image, because it's going to remove all the personal files and apps and settings off the box and reset the device to its initial state. Okay. And it can also deploy organizational apps and settings that are there as well. Now, there are a couple of different types of resets. One of them is a local Windows autopilot reset, and that will use Windows reset functionality. So you can use the local Windows autopilot reset regardless of how you're currently managing the device. But then you also have a remote Windows autopilot reset. So in order to initiate that, an admin can go into the Intune Center under Devices and Windows, select the device, and then choose an autopilot reset from there. Regarding troubleshooting for autopilot, okay, make sure you verify. So if you've got some issues going on, it's important to verify things like the configuration, like has Entra ID and Intune been configured as specified in the autopilot configuration requirements, right? So basically, did we follow the instructions when setting it up? Can the device access the services described in the Windows autopilot networking requirements? Remember all those, there's a whole bunch of URLs that need to be accessible, or domains that need to be accessible. In regards to your autopilot UBI behavior, where only the expected, the out of, where are the screens for the UBI being displayed? Was Entra ID credential page customized with any organization-specific details as expected? Right. In regards to Entra ID join, was the device able to join Entra ID? MDM enrollment, were we able to enroll in Intune? Okay. So one of the things that we have at our disposal is a Windows autopilot diagnostics, right? So you could take many of your troubleshooting techniques and put it into a readable format. And so what you can do is do an install script get autopilot diagnostics. That'll download that script. And then you can do once you've got the script downloaded, get autopilot diagnostics --online. Okay. And so then it can run through the process of testing things out. Okay, so it'll do a list of policies, it'll do apps, show you some status. If you're having some issues with Entra ID join, right, the most common issue is related to permissions. That's almost always the case, no matter what it is you're installing. Almost always the case, you got permission problems. Okay, so make sure you have the right permissions. The correct configuration is in place to allow users to join their devices to Entra. Perhaps they've already done too many devices, which happens frequently. Troubleshoot Intune enrollment. Okay, so common issues could include incorrect or missing licenses, or too many devices that were enrolled by the user. And troubleshooting your device import. So if you're experiencing a scenario where the importing the CSV results in no action and maybe you get an error, then the hash in the file might be corrupt, or perhaps the hash might not be properly padded in the file. Okay? So get in and make sure that that file is put together properly. All right. Now, dynamic deployment methods. Okay, so we're going to talk about dynamic deployment methods now. So let's take a look at this. So dynamic provisioning, like subscription activation, provisioning packages, Entra join, that will help you to reconfigure an existing operating system. So we're going to look at subscription activation, deployment using provisioning packages, also this tool known as the Windows Configuration Designer, and Entra join with automatic MDM enrollment. Okay, that'll be for your homework, but I'll just touch on it. Now, when we take a look at dynamic provisioning methods, these are the three different ones that we'll spend some time with right now: subscription activation, mobile device management, and provisioning packages. And so first one that's listed here is our subscription activation. So basically changing the key on it, right? Using a different activation method. And so note that you are required to comply with licensing requirements. Okay, so that is something to keep in mind, right? We can't just run on an unlicensed operating system forever. And so some of your current methods for activation currently will be things like KMS, or a key management service. And so this is a role service that you can use to activate systems in your network from a computer where a KMS host has been installed. And so by default, when you're working with volume license editions of Windows, then the KMS server is interacted with for activation. You also have what's known as a MAC, or a multiple activation key. So this is going to use product keys that can activate a specific number of computers. And so you can use MACs to activate any Windows Volume Edition. Last one is Active Directory activation. So a role service that allows you to use ADDS to store activation objects. That can actually help simplify the maintenance of volume activation services on your network. So when we're looking at subscription activations, then we can always move from one to another. And so Windows Pro can be updated or upgraded to Enterprise, notice, without a reinstall or a reboot. It basically just turns on or lights up the other features that are part of Enterprise that were not in Pro. And some subscription requirements: Windows Pro, Pro Education, Enterprise Education installed and activated. You do need to have an instance of Entra available for identity management, and then either Entra joined or hybrid Microsoft Entra joined devices in order to get this to work. Okay, so you can upgrade the or change your subscription. There's also what's known as VDA, or Virtual Desktop Access subscription activation. Okay, so Windows Enterprise E3 and E5 are available for that. Okay, to support this, you must configure your VMs to enable Windows Enterprise subscriptions for VDA. Note that both ADDS joined and Entra joined clients are supported here. But VDA subscription activation supports inherited activation. Okay, and so it enables a VM to inherit its activation state from the Windows host. Okay, so when a user with a Windows E3 or E5 license creates a VM on their host, the VM will inherit the activation state from that host machine. Okay, so in order to enable Windows subscription activation, your VMs must be running Windows 11 Pro, be on the domain or Entra joined, be generation 1, right? So no Gen 2 boxes, generation 1, and then be hosted by a qualified multi-tenant hoster like Azure. Okay. So VDA subscriptions are also available. Now, something else we could do is deploy using a provisioning package. A provisioning package. You create these provisioning packages using a tool known as the Windows Configuration Designer, or the WCD. Okay, so it's similar to the concept of group policies, but admins can use WCD. They choose the options for a specific configuration, and then WCD exports a package file that has those settings that can be used in Windows 11 devices. So you use that provisioning package to modify a Windows install and then configure a bunch of stuff without having to reinstall the OS. How cool is that, right? So things like configuring the Windows interface, or adding files or applications, managing certificates, removing software, or even resetting the Windows install to its initial state. Okay, so yes, you can achieve the same result by deploying a new Windows 11 image. Provisioning packages are small. Okay, so in that provisioning package, you can configure a whole bunch of stuff, right? And so things like computer account, if I go in and I modify what goes on with computer account, that could be the things that could be modified, like the name of the computer, which domain it's part of, what OU I want it created in, what user account you'll use to add the computer to the domain. Okay. You can also use edition upgrade, which is one of the options, right? So upgrade from Pro to Enterprise, okay? Upgrade from Home to Education, and these without reinstallation. You can change your product key and all that fun stuff. But after you configure the settings, you export the package out to a .ppkg file, and then during the export, you can encrypt the package, you can sign it, and if that provisioning package is signed, you can allow only packages that are trusted to be applied on computers. After that, on a computer that you want to provision it to, you do an add-provisioning package. Okay, and so that's all through PowerShell. So yeah, your WCD is what gets used to help create that whole thing. And there's a lot of stuff that you can configure in the WCD to create that .ppkg file. Entra join. Okay, Entra join with automatic MDM enrollment. Notice it's a similar concept to on-prem ADDS join, except for you join your organization device to Entra. Okay, so it helps to streamline that whole deployment process to the cloud. And so organizations can support scenarios like store-bought PCs. The user self-enrolls with their credentials. And during the enrollment process, organizational policies and configurations can be applied, right? Nice and easy. So we join the device to Entra, that gets enrolled into MDM, and now we can start configuring that box right away. Well, what about user-owned scenarios? MDM enrollment also provides an easy way for users and vendors to use their personal devices to access those organizational apps and resources. So users can add their Microsoft Work account to Windows and enjoy a simpler and safer way to access the apps and resources of the organization. And it will follow the policies of the IT department. But the users have the option to accept or reject them, but have to accept those policies in order to get access to the resources. Now, like your organization-owned devices, MDM will enforce compliance with your corporate policies, add or remove apps, and a lot more. Okay? In addition, your MDM can report a device's compliance, and that could be great for things like conditional access. Okay, plan a transition to modern endpoint management. So let's take a look at this feature now. So we're going to explore considerations and review the planning of transitioning to modern management, primarily focusing on migrations as well as newly provisioned devices. And so we'll spend some time looking at this. Co-management is going to be a piece of this that we talk about, which means you're doing both, managing with AD on-prem and SCCM, as well as Intune and Entra. Okay, so we'll talk about that, examining the prereqs, modern management considerations, and then we'll dig into just touching on some points for you to do with your homework on evaluating upgrades, migrating data, migrating workloads. All right, co-management. Anytime I hear that term, I always think of the Office episode where Michael and Jim are made co-managers of the office. But anyway, co-management. Moving to modern management can be challenging for some organizations, and because there's some new stuff to work with, new processes, new tools, and a lot of organizations still use their AD environment and SCCM to manage their devices. So in order to aid in modern management, co-management is available. So if you have an on-prem AD environment and you want to co-manage your domain joined devices, well, you can do this by configuring Entra hybrid joined devices. And so by bringing your devices to Entra ID, you maximize your users' productivity using single sign-on across on-prem and cloud-based resources. At the same time, you can secure access to your cloud and on-prem resources with conditional access. That's a capability of Entra. So now you can start taking advantage of some of that as well. And so with conditional access, you can implement automated access control decisions for accessing SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, and some other resources as well. Then you've got Intune, and that gives you a way to configure settings to achieve your administrative intent without exposing every possible setting. Now, in contrast, group policy gives you those fine-grained settings you control individually. With Intune, you can apply a broader privacy, security, and application management setting, lighter and more efficient tools. Okay? Intune also allows you to target internet-connected devices to manage policies without using group policy that do require on-prem domain joined devices. So MDM, good choice for devices on the go. When you're using co-management, then you should create one or more pilot groups of users and devices to phase this in, right? Start with a small group, add more users and devices as you roll out your environment. And so a good strategy, start with users and devices in IT, right? Let them suffer first and then build everything out. So when you're confident, move on to the next phase of rolling stuff out. But there are prereqs for co-management. Okay, your devices have to, or you need to configure your devices as Entra hybrid joined devices. That's going to be number one, right? And then you need to also make sure you're running the latest version of Entra Connect, right? Remember, that's that synchronization tool to take what's on-prem in Active Directory and sync it out to Entra. Make sure Intune is set up as your MDM and it's set up for automatic enrollment, okay, and that of course that it's installed. Active Directory joined devices are using Windows 11 or newer, okay, and that Entra is set for automatic enrollment. Now, Entra Hybrid Join is designed to facilitate the automatic registration of your on-prem domain joined devices with Entra ID. When it comes to transitioning your workloads to Intune, okay, once you've got all your prereqs and all that fun stuff done, then it's time to determine the specific workloads you want to transition to Intune. But before making any switches, make sure that you ensure that the workload has been appropriately configured and deployed within Intune. Okay? So some features of workloads that you can transition would be things like your resource access policies for things like Wi-Fi and email certificates and stuff like that. Any Windows update policies, endpoint protection policies. These are big, right? That would include things like antivirus and figure with group policy, and then Microsoft 365 select to run apps. So once the workload has been moved, well, the app will appear in the company portal on the device. Okay. A recommended approach, prioritize devices with simple configuration settings, migrate those to Intune first. Okay. Yeah, that'll, number one, get you familiar with the process, but then also give you a way to start seeing what else you might need to take care of on more complex deployments. And then evaluating modern management considerations. So just some things to note here. Note, remove the imaging process wherever possible, right? So that's something to note, okay? Also transforms the existing operating system with little or no user interaction and without deploying a new image. Okay, that's really nice for your users, right? Makes their life a lot easier. It deploys faster, it's more efficient, and with low network utilization, right? So a lot more lightweight than what we had in the old our old way of doing images and stuff like that. It does require Windows 11 or later. Okay? And then modern deployment can change an installation or an installed Windows 11 OS in a variety of ways, like removing pre-installed software, upgrading the edition, joining it to Entra ID, restricting the admin account, customizing the UBI. Those are all things that can be done with our modern deployments. And so when we take a look at a little chart here, you'll notice that the requirement to create gold image is part of MDT and Config Manager, but not Autopilot. Ability to rebuild or reset the devices for all three of them, right? But bare metal, not for Autopilot, yes for MDT and Config Manager. Can be used with any pre-installed operating system. For Autopilot, yes, for Windows 11. Okay. Installation of apps when devices being built, yes. Okay. Or when the OS is being built, I should say. Deployment of apps post-build, MDT is not going to support that, right? So after the build, during the build, yes, but not after the build. Config Manager, yes. Autopilot, yes. Migrating user data, yes, across the board. For Autopilot, it's going to take advantage of either ESR or OneDrive. In-place upgrades, yes, across the board on those as well. Okay, so helping you to see, hey, when we start looking more modern, like in the case of Autopilot, there are some things that are supported and some things that may not be supported. Then for the upgrades themselves, you'll notice scenarios to consider using imaging with modern management. BSOD, right? So blue screen of death, yeah, not normally a nice thing to have when we're done, so that might require imaging. Or if you deliver a series of complex apps and dependencies onto a device, which is then co-managed, that might require some imaging as well. Or if we've got some hardware failures, right? Well, because things like Autopilot will require an accessible system, yeah, you might still need to do a image. Situations such as client storage drive replacements, bare metal deployments, devices that do not support an upgrade path to the desired OS. Those might require imaging. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about Microsoft 365. Microsoft 365. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't, but this is Microsoft's cloud-based PC management solution. Okay. And so this is going to give you that personalized, secure Windows 11 experience from any device. And so we're going to explore it and discuss the configuration and administration. So when it comes to Windows 365, there are a couple different editions of it. We've got Business and we've got Enterprise. Okay, Windows 365 Business, made specifically for smaller companies up to 300 users. So just a little side note, anytime you hear that term for business or business, typically up to 300, right? Enterprise is above that. Okay, so made for smaller companies. There's no licensing prerequisites, no dependency on Azure or on Active Directory. And so purchases are made through the Microsoft 365 Admin Center or on the Windows 365 site. For Enterprise, it's designed for larger organizations that seek unlimited users to create cloud PCs. So the flexibility to build a custom cloud PC using your own device images gives some other capabilities too. So, which is nice for large organizations that have their own gold image. Okay. So yeah, there's some key differences between them, but to access a cloud PC, you can navigate to Windows 365 to .microsoft.com, get signed in, and then connect. Okay. Note that the remote desktop client is what's used for that. And so to configure this environment, well, the primary setup process takes place within Intune Admin Center. So you get an overview of the fundamental steps required to configure your system for provisioning those on-demand cloud PCs for your users. Okay. So you do need licenses. That's one thing, right? So go into add Intune, make sure that, or actually Microsoft 365 Admin Center, make sure that you have the proper licenses, and then you can provision those to your users. You also need an Azure network connection. An Azure network connection. So to enable your cloud PCs to join the organization's domain and access on-prem resources, you do need to have a network connection. This involves connecting to a virtual network in Azure that has been configured to facilitate connectivity with an on-prem environment. Okay, so that means you already have something like ExpressRoute or a VPN gateway configured in that virtual network in the cloud to support that configuration. Some other things that you might want to take a look at would be like configuring custom images. Okay, so an enterprise environment may have their own custom image that they might want to upload and utilize. Okay, create provisioning policies as well. And so those cloud PCs are created and assigned to users based on those provisioning profile policies. And then after the provisioning policies are created and assigned to those entry users, then Windows 365 service will check for appropriate licensing for each user, and they configure the cloud PCs accordingly. You can also do device and app profiles and configuration profiles. So once the initial setup is complete, those cloud PCs are configured just like a physical device. And so then you can create those configuration profiles and assign those to the users, to the devices and groups, just like any other device. Then administering, well, just like any other physical device. Okay, so most of the actions are the same. You can restart and sync. You can do a full scan. But there are 3 remote actions that are unique. One of them is reprovisioning. Excuse me. So when you do a reprovision, you roll the PC back to its initial state, but the user data, apps, and customizations aren't deleted. Okay. You also have resizing. So the resize lets you upgrade a cloud PC's RAM, CPU, and storage size. Okay. And then the last one there is collect diagnostics. And so for collect diagnostics, it's exactly as the name implies. So we can do that very thing to pull out information regarding to that particular computer. Now we've got something that sounds similar that we can use, and it's known as AVD. Okay, so there are some key differences between AVD and Microsoft Windows 365. Okay, so do this, but we'll talk a bit now about AVD. And so Windows 365 gives each user a dedicated fixed price cloud PC, but AVD is flexible, consumption-based, right? So you're paying for the computer all the time with 365, predictable cost, minimal backend management. AVD, you manage the infrastructure, the scaling, the images, the networking, and the optimization, okay? So Windows 365 is a fixed cost. AVD is pay as you go. Okay? So let's talk a little bit now about AVD. And so we're going to get a chance to take a look at AVD, to manage AVD, and that's a cloud-based VDI solution, right? Virtual desktop infrastructure solution for personalized, secure Windows 11 experiences. So let's talk about examining it, exploring it, and then you'll note configure and administer are listed as homework. Okay, so in regards to examining AVD, well, it's a cloud-based desktop and app virtualization service on Azure. Okay, so this is access to the remote desktops and apps across various devices. And so you can connect to the AVD environment with any sort of client, right? Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, Linux, and it will give them a Windows 11 environment. You'll notice it talks here about Windows 10, but 11 is the one that's being used now. Okay, so Some benefits. Oh my goodness, enhanced security is definitely going to be a big one, right? So you could centralize the security management for those user desktops with Entra ID, do things like MFA, granular role-based access controls as well. And then running your data and apps on remote servers will reduce the risk of confidential data on personal devices. It leads to simpler management as well. Okay, familiar management tools for Azure admins, like Entra, RBAC, VM deployments, and stuff like that. Plus Azure Monitor for monitoring and alerts. Performance management, we could do load balancing across VM host pools for optimal performance, and then either go for breadth mode, right? So we're spreading the workload across multiple servers, or depth mode to fully allocate the use of a server before moving on to another one to support our environment. We have multi-session Windows 10 deployments, and so AVD does support, and you notice it says Windows 10 also supports Windows 11 multi-session. So it's a true multi-session environment. And it's a desktop environment, not a server, right? It's a desktop. So you can support desktops as well. Compute cost savings as well. So purchase 1 year or 3 year Azure Reserve virtual machine instances. You can save a lot of money up front. Okay? So that's something to think about. And you do need to make sure that you have licensing in place. So in regards to Azure Virtual Desktop, it's considered a PaaS solution, platform as a service. That means there's going to be a little bit more care involved. Microsoft does supply for you the hardware-based infrastructure, but AVD runs in Azure, and common use cases, security and regulation applications, right? So we want to make sure that our data doesn't just leak onto somebody's computer. An elastic workforce, people coming and going, right? And so we don't need to necessarily pay for a bunch of seats dedicated to just individuals, for employees, for specialized workloads as well. But your AVD environment, you can establish a true multi-session Windows 10 or 11 experience. If you've ever set up an RDS environment before, you know that with RDS, you're using a server. Some apps kind of don't like that. And so if you have a client or a desktop experience, that can make it nicer both for the user and for those apps. You can deploy the Microsoft 365 apps on them, on those AVD environments, that platform as a service environment. Virtualize both desktop and individual apps. That's a very powerful capability. So you can actually run an app remotely on a computer. So you don't necessarily have to have the entire desktop at someone's disposal or at the disposal for a user. You can have just a single app. You can administer desktops and apps through a unified management platform. And so key capabilities, it's a desktop virtualization environment in Azure. Host pools are published as needed to support your workloads. You can use your own image if you wanted to. You could pull data from the Azure gallery for an image that you wanted to use as well. You can save on costs with pooled multi-session resources. So like basically it's like building a bigger computer and then letting more people use it at one time. You can offer individual ownership as well with persistent or personal desktops. So now it's not a pooled resource, it's a personal resource or a shared resource, but a personal resource. And then auto scale can take place as well. Okay. So you can deploy and manage and assign or connect users to virtual desktops. So really cool service that's available. And so when it comes to configuring that virtual desktop environment, then you can create your host pool. That could be a personal one, a personal host pool. Then create a session host virtual machine that's joined to Entra. Create a workspace in an application group that's going to publish a desktop to that session, assign the users to the app group, and connect to the desktop. But note that you will need, if you wanted to configure AVD here, you'll need an Azure account with an active subscription. The account has to be assigned the owner or contributor RBAC roles on that subscription. You need a VNet in the same region you want to deploy your session hosts. You need a user account in Entra you can use for connecting to the desktop. And you also need a remote desktop client installed. Okay, and so there's a whole list of remote desktop clients that Microsoft does make available on their site that will support this. In regards to administering AVD, okay, there's a lot of stuff to take into consideration. Note that there's an entire almost week-long course on just nothing but AVD. So we're kind of just scratching the surface here. But if you want to administer the AVD environment, you can use the Azure CLI and Azure PowerShell if you wanted to. Okay, the CLI extension in PowerShell for Azure Azure Virtual Desktop to create, update, delete, and interact with AVD objects instead of using the portal. So you may find that a little more handy if you enjoy using command line. Note that you do need the Azure CLI and the Azure PowerShell module in order to do these things. So with Azure CLI, it's the AZ space desktop virtualization. And with the PowerShell environment, you're going to use the az.desktop virtualization module. Note that the Azure CLI extension doesn't have commands for applications. So if in that case, you'll need to use the PowerShell module instead. Last piece we'll touch on is the Intune suite. The Intune suite. And so we're going to talk about the Intune suite, the advanced device management, security capabilities, usage, integration with the broader Microsoft security ecosystem. And we're going to touch on just a few items here. Okay, the essentials of the Intune suite, zero trust security, implementing endpoint privilege management, and understanding enterprise app management. And then there's a few things that are listed as being for your homework. Okay, so essentials of the Intune suite. Okay, well, the task of managing devices, apps, and data across both your remote and hybrid workforces are becoming more challenging. And so there's a list of tools that we can use that's part of the Intune suite. This is going to be mission critical advanced endpoint management and security capabilities on top of what you can use already with Intune. So to explore these add-ins, go to your tenant in Intune and then look under the add-ons, and then you can see the add-ons that are part of your Intune environment. Now, you could buy a standalone add-on, but there's going to be some things that you may just want to dig right into Plan 2 or the whole Intune suite. Just a reminder, because this is licensing, spend some time researching it during the study time that you have. And so when looking at the Intune suite, you'll notice the Intune suite basically includes everything, right? Endpoint privilege management and app management and analytics, tunneling, specialized device management, right? So for doing things like point of sale and kiosk and stuff like that, firmware over the air to update the firmware on some of your devices remotely. But by using the Microsoft Intune suite and all the add-ons that are part of it, you actually enhance your organization's device management, security, and compliance capabilities. Well, one of the things we need to note and always keep in mind is this zero trust. Zero trust, that's going to be that security framework that assumes somebody's going to do something bad. A very pessimistic point of view there, right? Threats can come from anywhere inside or outside the network. So there's continuous verification of users, of devices, and of applications before granting access to those corporate resources. And so the Intune suite actually plays a key role in implementing zero trust by integrating with other security solutions to enforce strict access controls, device compliance, and identity verification. For example, it can work with conditional access policies, right? So conditional access works with Entra to continuously evaluate risks that are associated with your users, with your devices, the locations, the apps that they're using, etc. And only when specific conditions are met will access be granted. For device compliance policies, okay, this allows IT administrators to enforce some rules, making sure only secure and managed devices can access corporate data. You've got your app protection policies. Okay, this allows IT to enforce security settings at the application level, ensuring corporate data within apps is encrypted and isolated from personal data shared only in appropriate channels. With endpoint privilege management, this is a key feature of working with the Intune suite. It enforces least privilege access by granting temporary administrative privileges for specific tasks, minimizing the risk of privilege escalation attacks and reducing the attack surface by ensuring that only users that need it have access for specific tasks. And lastly, the integration with Defender for Endpoint. Okay, that's a big piece of that. So advanced threat detection and response capabilities. Your devices are continuously being monitored for threats. And so Intune can then work in conjunction with that zero trust environment. Now, in regards to implementing endpoint privilege management, well, there's some things to note. Now, as part of that Intune suite, endpoint privilege management can help to really enhance the security of a device. Notice it's there for giving necessary permissions to complete specific tasks to specific users. Okay, that means that the users don't have to wait for full-time admin rights, and so minimizing disruptions to their workflow. And so endpoint privilege management policy allows you to assign a variety of different types of permissions. So when you're doing your authoring, the endpoint privilege management policy authoring capability is required to work with policy or data reports for endpoint privilege management. Okay. And so you'll notice you get things like the ability to view some reports, create, read, update, and delete, and even assign some capabilities. When it comes to the endpoint privilege management elevation requests, well, this permission is required to work with elevation requests that are submitted by users for approval. And so you get the permissions of view elevation requests and modify elevation requests. And there's a variety of other roles as well. Then you've got your enterprise app management. Okay, and so enterprise app management in the Intune suite gives you the tools that you need in order to secure, deploy, and manage your corporate apps across your devices. Okay, whether they're corporate owned or they're BYOD. And so you get some key features of data protection. And so enforcing things like encryption, restricting copy paste, preventing data backup to third-party apps, conditional access as well for setting conditions for app usage based on things like device compliance, and giving you granular control, what apps can do with corporate data. Okay. So there's some big benefits of working with app management. Okay. Number one, it's streamlined, right? It allows you to save time and reduce complexity by streamlining the whole app management process. But also you can stay current with updates. You're able to keep apps up to date. You can easily create apps for new versions of products as they're available in the catalog as well. All right. So what did we just spend some time with? We talked about a lot of stuff, and we are just about out of time now. We talked about working with autopilot, implementing dynamic deployment methods, planning a transition to modern endpoint management, managing Windows 365, managing Azure Virtual Desktop, and also touched on the endpoint management suite, or Intune management suite. So this will conclude day 4 of the MD-102 Microsoft 365 Endpoint Administrator course. Have a great day. Thank you.